All right, so we just got news that the IRS is going to treat Bitcoin and digital currencies as property. What are your thoughts on this, and how does it affect you?
Well, I'm really surprised that this ruling came out with no opportunity for public comment, because if they had discussed this and given us an opportunity to discuss it within the community and offered feedback, we would have discussed this because, frankly, this is an untenable position. It's great for investors because it gives them clarity in capital gains. But what it means is if I buy a cup of coffee, I need to do a capital gains response for the cup of coffee because it's also a currency. And right now, that doesn't work in any other currency. If I buy euros or sterling in my brokerage account, it's treated as an investment and I pay capital gains. If I go to London and I change money into sterling to buy a hotel ticket and to visit the zoo, I don't pay capital gains on the sterling I just spent at the zoo. And right now what they're saying is that in Bitcoin, I will have to pay capital gains. Not just that, it's not a matter of what we pay in taxes, because we want to pay out taxes. I want to pay my taxes. It's about how much paperwork am I going to have to do. Well, I have to account for every single cup of coffee I spent Bitcoin on, because I'm using it as a consumer currency and an investment. And so it would have been much more sensible to have a use case based analysis, so that if I use it as an investment, if I convert it into dollars, for example, that's an investment in capital gains. But if I use it as a currency to buy something from Amazon or from Tiger Direct or from Overstock, reporting capital gains is ridiculous. It's going to cause a mountain of paperwork. And quite honestly, I think this is a typical mistake, because without asking for public comment, I don't think they understood the implications of this choice.
And I think you mentioned a really good point here. Now, with a lot of these regulatory agencies, and I used to work on Capitol Hill, so my job was to be the liaison between constituents, businesses of the districts, and these regulatory bodies. And a lot of times they do open up a period for comments. And why they didn't do it for this, I'm not really sure, but do you think that that shows that there's a failure of representation in Washington, D.C. for the Bitcoin community?
Well, I don't think it's a failure of representation, because we have plenty of representatives who travel to DC all the time to talk to representatives in DC. I think the problem is an insular culture within the IRS, and frankly, they didn't do their homework in this particular case. And they issued a ruling, and it's like a declaration by fiat, without asking anyone who actually understands the technology what the implications for this technology would be. When I was first on the internet, we had a period of time when the IRS and the government in general took a stand-back approach and said, let's wait and see how this is going to play out before we start throwing regulations out, because we need to understand this technology. And that gave the internet an opportunity to thrive and to develop. And all we need in Bitcoin is an equal opportunity to explain our position, to understand how these regulations are going to affect us, and to frankly educate the legislators and regulators on the implications of these decisions. This particular decision will cause tremendous problems. It will cause a mountain of paperwork for people who use it as a currency.
And these regulations that came out today, they apply to fiscal year 2013, just a couple weeks ahead of the April 15th deadline.
Yes.
So are you going to have to redo everything you did last year as it applies to your taxes now?
Well, actually, last year I had very little in terms of capital gains and investment. And so, yes, I'm going to have to redo everything. I mean, the bigger problem is that right now that still creates a lot of uncertainty. What happens in 2020 when they come back to me and they say, we have a question about your 2014 taxes, and I have to pay 6 years of interest and penalties because I got a tiny mistake on paying, you know, to enter the zoo in Bitcoin, essentially, or to buy a cup of coffee. I use it as a currency, and now I have to account for that. We don't have the mechanisms to do that level of accounting right now. And so this is going to make things very, very difficult. I mean, I'm going to ask for an extension, and I'm going to do a lot of work and pay a lot of money to tax accountants in order to figure it out. And I think a lot of people in Bitcoin are going to be burdened with a regulation that really is untenable.
Okay, but on the other side, we have seen the government take a step back, and they haven't, for a while, they've kind of put a blind eye to Bitcoin because they didn't want to legitimize Bitcoin. If the government recognized, started regulating Bitcoin, then that means that it actually does exist and it's a legitimate currency that we have. So can we find any bright side to this, that now the IRS has at least acknowledged Bitcoin exists? Do you think that's pushing forward Bitcoin as a legitimate payment system?
Well, I think it's very important to have clarity, so I'm glad for the clarity. At least now we can start the conversation, a conversation that should have happened earlier with a public comment period. But at least now we have some clarity so we can have the conversation. We can explain why it's a bad idea to treat it only as property and not as property when it's used as property and investment, and as currency when it's used as currency, just like any other currency is treated that way. We have an opportunity to have that discussion, and I'm glad for the clarity because, quite honestly, I want to pay my taxes, and I need clarity in order to pay my taxes correctly.